Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the breakout session for enterprise security for big data solutions on Azure HD Insight. I am Soren Shah, a senior program manager in the Azure HD Insight team, and today I'll be showing you some of the new functionalities and the latest functionalities that we have done in Azure HD Insight to secure your big data solutions and your big data architectures on Azure. But before I do that, I really want to thank you for coming over here. I know after 4 days of long Ignite sessions, and this being the last session before the grand party, I truly appreciate you coming over here. Like some of my friends are already at their hotel rooms. But that being said, I think you will find the session very useful because of situations like this. Now, less than a month ago, Equifax, which is one of the institutions which holds most sensitive data about millions of customers, got breached. Now, if someone would tell me that all the people sitting over here got affected by the breach, I would not be surprised at all. 143 million people and their records got affected and compromised because of the Equifax breach. Now, when I started looking a little bit around and poking things on what really happened, so there was a tool called Apache Struts. And Apache Struts is an open source technology. It's used for building websites and front-end websites. So there was a vulnerability in that tool. Equifax used that Apache Struts into building their online dispute portal. And the hackers took advantage of that vulnerability, and they got through many of the records, customer records on Equifax. Now, you may be wondering, like, what does Apache Struts have to do with big data? It actually doesn't. There is no relationship. But the point which I want to bring over here is that when you take a dependency on any open source component, you should be very sure that your entire architecture is secure and very tight. If it's not, then situations like these happen. Now, let's take an example of a Hadoop breach, a Hadoop installation which got attacked sometime in January. Now, this wasn't as severe as the Apache Struts or the Equifax breach. Over here, a hacker, he just went to a Hadoop cluster and deleted all the files which he could find on the cluster. And he left a note for the administrator. I cannot read out the note because it would be inappropriate to read it out right here. But the point being here that even though this was not severe, many analysts after this incident started investigating and looking at which Hadoop instances or which Hadoop clusters are affected and are vulnerable. And they found out that about 8,000 to 10,000 clusters worldwide are actually vulnerable today. We don't want your Hadoop installations or your clusters or big data solutions to get affected. And that's why Azure HD Insight has implemented some very, very cool functionalities which will help you to secure your environments. But before I dive deep into that, how many of people over here know about Azure HD Insight? Oh, that's quite a lot. And how many of you have actually tried creating a cluster? Wow, that's awesome. I love you guys. So for those of you who don't know what Azure HD Insight is, it's a fully managed Hadoop and Spark offering on Azure Cloud. We provide 3 nines SLA. Using Azure HD Insight, you can spin up a cluster, a cluster containing open source components within just a few minutes. It provides you the compute horsepower. It's completely elastic, so you can scale up, scale down your clusters as much as you can. Your data will stay on separate remote stores, so it won't be affected at all. We manage the clusters for you, so if anything goes wrong on the clusters, we will manage it, our engineers will debug it, and we'll make sure that it's highly available. Apart from that, it's very much extensible, so you can take any open source component, you can install it on the cluster you want. There are a lot of ISV applications, and you can extend your clusters using that. So without wasting any time, let me just show you a very quick demo on how to create and how easy is it to create an Azure HD Insight cluster. So here I am on Azure portal. And how I reached this page is just clicking New Data Analytics HD Insight. Very simple. There are just 3 steps required to create a HD Insight cluster. And in the first step, I'll just specify the cluster name. So let's say Ignite Demo 105. My subscription. And in the cluster type, there are various cluster types available. I'll choose Spark. This is the most popular cluster type. And then it asks me for an admin username password. So let me just give out some admin username password. I can use my existing resource group. And that's it. Like, only just so much information is needed on the step number 1. On step 2, you will find out that I have to choose data stores. So as I mentioned before, HD Insight gives you this compute horsepower on Azure Cloud. And all your data stores on remote stores, which is either Blob Store or Data Lake Store. I can choose either of these, which is really nice because you can take down your HD Insight cluster, and all your data still stays on the Blob Store or the Data Lake Store, or whichever store you choose. So here I'll just choose a simple store and click Next. And on the summary page, after validation, I can just hit Create, and it will create a cluster within 10 to 15 minutes. So it's as simple to create as to stand up a Spark cluster on Azure Cloud using HD Insight. Now, I won't create the cluster right now, but I already have one created over here. So let me go to the cluster dashboard and pass in the username password, which I had already passed in during cluster creation. Once I log in, you will find out that I'm logged in into Ambari. And well, demos never work for the first time. So let me try again. Log in onto Ambari. And when I log on to Ambari, there is the management portal and the metrics portal. I am the admin user. I can go and I can run any commands using the Hive view. Or I can also run commands from outside the portal using the Visual Studio scripts or IntelliJ or any other scripts. Okay. All right. So moving forward, let's just dive right deep into the security aspects. So when you think about big data security, there are 4 big aspects or 4 main aspects, which is perimeter level security, authentication, authorization, and data level security. So perimeter level security is protecting your HD Insight cluster or your Hadoop cluster from outside or from outside threats. Authentication means allowing only the people who are authenticated or who have permissions to access your cluster and run commands on your cluster. And authorization means really role-based access control. So there are some users who are admins, some are users, some are read-only users, some are write-only users. And lastly, there is data security, which means like all your data is encrypted. So even if some hacker tries to manages to get to your data, they will still not be able to access the data over there. So in the next 60 minutes or so, I will dive deep into each of these aspects and show you what the customer scenarios are and show you some demos on how you can set up your whole architecture on HD Insight. So customer scenarios about perimeter security. When we analyze these scenarios for perimeter security, they all boil down to just a single sentence, which is, I want my data to be private, always. And what does that really mean? When you have a cluster which is on your on-premises, yes, your data is always private because the data never goes outside your on-premises network. But what does that really mean in terms of Azure? On Azure, how you achieve it is using virtual networks and network security groups. So let's imagine that there is a customer, Contoso, who has their enterprise network over here, and they own the HD Insight cluster. So what they can do is they can create the HD Insight cluster within a virtual network, and they can create some network security groups or boundaries or firewall rules. The network security groups are built in such a way that only requests coming from the enterprise network will be allowed to access the HT Insight cluster, and no other request will be allowed to access. So if there is a user foo who is accessing the HT Insight cluster from within the enterprise network, the request will be successful. For any other users who are coming from outside the clusters, the request will not be successful. Once HT Insight gets the request, it processes the workloads, and then it fetches the data from either blob store or data lake store. It runs the jobs and returns the results to the customer. To see how network security groups are created on Azure, this is a screenshot. The circled network security group is for Contoso data center, which is for a certain IP address range, which is owned by the enterprise network. Any request which is coming from that IP address range on port 443 will be allowed to go into the HT Insight cluster. All the other requests will be rejected. Now, if you notice, there are 4 other rules over here, which is HDI rule 1 through 4. And you may be wondering, what are those rules? Those are the IP addresses of the management services that we own. So if you remember, I told you before, HT Insight is a fully managed Hadoop and Spark offering, which means we monitor your clusters. We make sure that your clusters are highly available, up and running all the time. And those 4 IP addresses are the addresses of the management services that we mandate you to keep on your network security groups so that your clusters are visible to us. OK, so we built these functionalities, and then some customers started asking us that, wow, this is good. Our data or our requests to your virtual networks is private. But what about the data which actually is stored on the blob storage accounts? When HT Insight makes a call to fetch that data from blob storage, that goes through public internet. So what about how to make it private? And we heard that feedback. Azure Blob Store and networking team got together, and they built a service tunnel, or a tunnel which is between the virtual network and the blob storage. So using that tunnel, all your data which is on blob storage, if it is accessed from any resources in the virtual network, it will always be private in Azure's backbone. No data will be exposed to public internet at all. And the way to achieve that is there's a screenshot over here, which is for a storage account. And on that storage account, you will notice that I have selected networks and just some virtual networks with an IP address range, which means that all the data which is in the blob store or this storage account will only be accessed by resources within this virtual network. And whenever they access, it will be service tunneled, and it will all go through Azure's backbone and no public internet access. So let's see a quick demo on this. So this is the HT Insight security or the network security rules, which I had shown you before. You can see the Contoso data center rule for the Contoso data center. And now I'll show you how to attach this to a virtual network. It's actually very simple. We have a virtual network called ADVNet. I go to the subnets where I want to deploy HT Insight cluster. And on the subnet, I can select network security group. I can select HDI security and just hit save. It's actually as simple as attach as that on attaching the network security group to the virtual network. Now, how do you create HT Insight within a virtual network? Let me just show you a very quick demo on that one too. So this was going back to the page where we are creating HT Insight. If I go to the advanced settings, and there is a drop down for virtual networks, so I can just select the ADVNet and hit next. And it's actually as simple as just selecting your virtual network from the drop down. And after this, the HT Insight cluster will have the private IP addresses of the virtual network. It will have the NSG rules, and any requests which are from the Contoso data center, only those requests will go through the cluster. Now moving on to the next set of scenarios, which is authentication. If we summarize all the scenarios in authentication, they all boil down to just a single sentence, which is, I want only authenticated users to access the data. And what does that mean in terms of our infrastructure or our architecture? So going back to our simple diagram before, we have the Contoso data center. The users in Contoso data center are making requests to the HD Insight cluster. But I added a new thing over here that they are always passing in a username and a password. Without the username password, the request will not go to the cluster at all. On HD Insight cluster, we have a layer called a gateway layer, which actually validates each and every request that comes in. It validates that the username, password is correct on that request, and then only it allows the request to move on or go forward to the Hadoop components. If it's not authenticated, it will not allow the request to move forward at all. So in this diagram, I've shown that, if you remember before, when I created the HD Insight cluster, I passed in a single username and password. It was the admin user, and there was a password. There are so many customers who said, like, we don't really want to share this admin username password amongst all the different users. And there is a functionality that we enabled in Ambari where you can create multiple users. So many different users can come with their own username password. So for example, if you see this example, there is user 1 and user 2. These are the local users who are created on Ambari by the admin user at all. The many other employees can come up with this username password, and they can send requests to HD Insight. This functionality is available in all cluster types. It's available in standard, SKU, on any cluster types. And I'll show a demo of this functionality. But there are some customers who came back to us and said that, why do we have to manage new user accounts? And why do we have to manage the passwords for these new user accounts? I have some employees in my organization, and they just want to log on using their domain names. And so, for example, I want to log in on the cluster using soren@microsoft.com and that. So we have that functionality available in premium clusters. So how this works is the Contoso data center, they sync their users to Azure AD. They enable domain services on Azure AD. Domain services is a new functionality available in Azure AD. And HD Insight, when HD Insight cluster is created, it will work with the domain services, and it will create a premium cluster, which is a Kerberized cluster. So next time when the users come in with their username password to HD Insight goes to the domain services and validates the username password, that this user is correct. After it validates, it fetches the Kerb ticket or Kerberos ticket for that user. It will use the Kerberos ticket, and it will pass the Kerberos ticket amongst the different Hadoop components, and then it will execute the job. Meanwhile, it will also fetch the data from Blob Store. It will execute the job and return the results to the customers. Now, with this setup, if any employee comes with their domain username password, and as long as the domain services is enabled, we'll fetch the tickets, and multi-user authentication works on the premium clusters. So let's see some demos on the multi-user authentication. So previously, I showed you an HD Insight cluster, which was this multi-user Ambari cluster. So I had logged in on the cluster using the admin account. And actually, let me log in again. And when I log in on the account, you will notice that when I go to Manage Ambari, you will see the users management page, and you will see the user 1 and user 2 over here. These are local users. And I can go and I can spin up another incognito window and log in using these user 1 and user 2 accounts. And they will be able to run the jobs as well. So this is a standard cluster. Now let me show you a premium cluster and try to log in on the premium clusters using multiple accounts. So this is an LLAP cluster. It's a premium LLAP cluster or an interactive query cluster. We recently GA'd this functionality. Actually, just yesterday we GA'd this functionality on HDInsight. So when I try to log in on this cluster, I will log in not as an admin user, but as a domain user. And the domain user over here, which is hdiuser@contoso.com, it actually happens to be an admin on the cluster as well. So when I log in, you will notice that this user is also taken to Ambari. The experience is exactly the same. The only difference over here is that this is a Kerberized cluster. We have automatically set up Kerberos on this cluster by just hooking up with the domain services. This user can still go to HiveView and run jobs or run queries on the HiveView. It can also go to Zeppelin on the LLAP clusters and run queries on the Zeppelin as well. Okay, so now let me show you how to log in on this cluster using another domain account. So I'm going to, and I will be logging in using another domain account, which is DS1. So on this cluster, I created 4 domain accounts, DS1, DS2, DS3, DS4. These are just data scientist 1, data scientist 2, 3, and 4. So I'm logged in on that cluster using a DS1 data storage as well. Let me actually show you Manage Ambari on this cluster. So when I go to Manage Ambari, you will see that there are user pages, and these are the 4 different users, DS1, 2, 3, and 4. And you will notice that these are LDAP users, and they are not local users. So LDAP users means they are coming from the customer's on-premises or the customer's directory or the Active Directory. Here I am logged in as DS1. And now I can go and run any Hive queries or any queries which are available on this cluster. Okay. So far we saw multi-user authentication using standard clusters and multi-user authentication using domain credentials on the premium clusters. Now let's move forward to the next set of scenarios, which is the authorization scenarios. And the authorization scenarios, they all fall for the RBAC. And when we listen to the customers, they all fall under 2 different categories, 2 main categories. The first one is I want only privileged users to have access to sensitive data. And the second one is I want only privileged users to perform privileged operations. Now let's see what does that mean on HDInsight. So the first one is on Ambari, you can perform a lot of operations. You can perform very high privileged operations like take down the whole cluster, move the cluster to maintenance mode. Or you can do like reboot a node or reboot services, which are available only to Ambari administrators. And there are some other operations that are available on Ambari that you can query some data from Hive databases or Hive tables, which are available for a very low privileged user like a cluster user. And these all roles, like there are 6 different roles, and there's a laundry list of all the items that is available for these roles. These are available on our premium clusters in Ambari. Actually, they are available in standard clusters as well. So that's the first requirement, that I want privileged users to have access to privileged operations. The second one, which is I want privileged users to have access to only sensitive data, that's available using Apache Ranger. Now, Apache Ranger is a centralized policy management portal. It manages policies for various open source components like Hive, Storm, HBase, Yarn, Kafka, and many others. On this cluster, or on this screenshot, you will see that we have Yarn policies, WASB policies, and Hive policies. Yes? I will get to that. Yes. So Yarn policies, WASB policies, and Hive policies. In these policies, the admin can really go and create very fine-grained policies that allow data scientist one user to have access to only certain columns of a table. And Ranger goes even beyond that, where you can create data masking policies also. So in the data masking policies, the admin can go and say that allow data scientist user to have access to all the columns, but mask out all the sensitive data from the sensitive columns. And we'll see a demo for that. So this is how Ranger works, a very simplistic diagram of how Ranger works. The users in the enterprise Contoso data center, they are still sending requests using their username password. HD Insight goes and validates the username passwords with the domain. And then HD Insight will see that what kind of job is this user running and what resources is the user accessing. Then it will go to Ranger and it will ask, like, does this user have permissions to the resources which he wants to run? If Ranger says yes, then HD Insight goes and executes the job. If the Ranger says no, then HD Insight will throw an error to the user saying you are not authorized to access these resources. And we'll see a demo for that one too. Apart from authorization policies, Ranger gives some functionalities for auditing as well. So whatever policies the admin has created, the admin can go to Ranger and they can look at all the auditing requests or the audit logs, and they can see which users tried to access which resources, which one were allowed and which one were not allowed. In the last segment of the authorization comes file and folder level permissions. So this is a very, very key functionality, and people who have Hadoop clusters running on their on-premises, they are very well aware of this functionality. So when you have a Hadoop cluster running on-premises, you have all the data running on your local disks, and you have local HDFS on your clusters. You or the administrator can set a very good policies on the local HDFS saying that user foo has access only to the folder foo data. User bar has access only to the folder bar data. And whenever user foo runs jobs, if the jobs are accessing any other folder other than foo data, the jobs will fail. Now it's a very big challenge when you move this infrastructure onto Azure Cloud. As I mentioned before, your data stays in two different places, which is Azure Storage and Azure Data Lake Store. Azure Storage does not have any built-in functionalities for file and folder level permissions like it is on the local HDFS. So what we have done in HD Insight is we went ahead and we created a WASB plugin in Apache Ranger to simulate those functionalities, the same file and folder level functionalities that you have in local HDFS. And on Azure Data Lake Store, on the other hand, it has built-in file and folder level permissions, where you can go and set very fine-grained file and folder level permissions. And what HD Insight does is it will have seamless integration with those file and folder level permissions, which means like if you log in onto the cluster using your own credentials, HD Insight will pass those credentials all the way down to Data Lake Store, and it will respect those file and folder level permissions that the administrator has set on the Data Lake Store. There is an asterisk on that one. There is one caveat on that this functionality is not available for the users that have multi-factor authentication set up. And we are working towards overcoming that limitation as well very soon. But as long as you don't have MFA set up, all the users' credentials will be passed directly from the request all the way down to the store. And we'll see a demo for that one as well. Now, these two key functionalities, I truly believe that they are not available on any big data solution on Azure, or actually any cloud. Cloudera or Hortonworks or Amazon EMR, like they don't have this functionality which we have built. The Ranger plugin for storage or the data lake seamless integration. And we'll see some the demos for these ones too. So let's see demos for authorization. Okay. So first, let me show you here. I am logged in onto the LLAP cluster using HDI user. When I go to LLAP, I go to, say, a admin notebook. And on the admin notebook, I am running select star from supplier. There is a lot of data in the supplier table, but some of the data, which is the supplier name and the supplier point of contact, these are sensitive information. Like this table, this column, and this column. And as an admin, I don't really want any data scientist to have access to these sensitive data. So what I can do is I can go to the cluster and add Ranger policies for that. To go to Ranger policies, I can just go to /Ranger/. Now on the Ranger, you will notice that I am using a single Ranger database, which is shared amongst 4 different clusters. If you see the YARN policies and the WASP policies, there are 4 different repositories for 4 different clusters. But if you notice over here on Hive, there is just a common repository. So which means that I am sharing Ranger policies. The Ranger policies are all into a single database. They are all shared amongst 4 different clusters. And if your clusters go down or they come back up, or if you delete the clusters and recreate them, pointed to the same Ranger database, they will start, they will seamlessly start back up again, and they will start respecting the Ranger policies. So when you delete the clusters, your policies or all the hard work which you have done to create the policies don't go away. So let's go to the Hive policies. And I've created a policy called supplier table. Let's look at the supplier table policy. What this policy says that this is for a supplier table. In the default database for the supplier table, give access to all the columns to the Hadoop users group. Now, Hadoop users group is the group of the 4 data scientists 1 through 4. So which means I'm giving only select permissions to all of these data scientists from the supplier table. But if you remember, there were 2 columns which were sensitive data, which was the name column and the point of contact column. So what the admin could do is change this to exclude and say exclude the access to the name column or the point of contact column. That is one possibility. And when the data scientist 1 tries to access those columns, they will get an access denied. But there is an even better way to do it, which is through the data masking. So if you go to data, if you see in data masking, there are 2 policies that I've created, the supplier name and the supplier point of contact. So let me show you the policies. On the supplier point of contact, I've created a policy saying that for default database, for the supplier table and the point of contact column, mask out or hash out all the values for anyone who is part of the Hadoop users group. So what really this means is when a data scientist 1 tries to go and run and look at the values in this column, he will not see the real values, but he will just see some garbled values. And let's look at that. So here I am logged in onto the same cluster using data scientist 1. This is the LLAP security demo. And if I go to users, data scientist 1, and if I go to note 1, you will see that I'm able to access the columns, total orders, or the category, and the total orders. But if I go to Hive, and if I try to access select star from supplier, let's see what happens. So let's go to Hive view. I'm logged in as data scientist 1. And if I run select star from supplier, if you see the results, in the results, the data scientist one has access to all the columns, which was before, but the supplier name column and the point of contact column, the values are all hashed out. Yes? This is the interactive Hive cluster. Yes, this is the interactive Hive cluster. Okay, all right. So we saw how you can create a ranger policy, and now let me show you the file and folder level permissions demo as well. So this is a blob store account, which I am sharing amongst all the different clusters. All the 4 clusters are sharing the blob store account, which I mentioned before that your data is externalized. The meat of the data stays in this, or actually there is a sample container which I created called user data. And in the user data, I have a DS1 folder. And in the DS1 folder, I have a file called sales.csv. Now, as blob store does not have any built-in file and folder level permissions, right? But when you go to Ranger, this is actually an Ignite Spark demo cluster. So on Ranger, when I go, I have created 2 different policies for the DS1 folder. So let's look at these policies. This policy says for the storage account, HDI security demo store, which is this storage account, for the container user data, which is this container, and anything which is in the relative path of DS1, only allow the user DS1 or the data scientist one to have read-write access. Don't allow any other user to have any access to the files contained under the DS1 folder. So what does this really mean? So when I go to, let's see. So when I go to the cluster, the Ignite Spark demo cluster, and when I'm logged in on Zeppelin using the DS1 folder, I'm running a very simple Spark command, which is read this text file or read this CSV file and count the number of rows. Now, if you look at this file, or if you look at this command, where I'm reading the DS1 sales file, and I can retrieve the records that there are 114,000 records created, which means I can read this file. I am logged in as a DS1 folder. Now let's see if I am logged in as a DS2 or the data scientist 2 on the same cluster, and I go to Zeppelin and I try to run the same commands. When I try to run the same commands when I'm logged in as the data scientist 2, you will notice that I get a WASB authorization exception, and I get a file status, get file status operation is not allowed. So this is how we achieve the file and folder level permissions on WASB using the Ranger plugin that we created for WASB. Okay. Again, to show you the Ranger plugin for WASB, this is the policy that we created. There are a lot of policies that we have already created, and they all store under the WASB plugin on this Ranger. Okay, let's move on to the next segment of demos. Yes, go ahead.
So, not security per se, but compliance.
Yeah.
How does it support, for example, a GDPR scenario?
So compliance is a whole different aspect, but when this goes GA, so this functionality is all available in preview right now. When this goes GA, we will have all the compliance available, which is about the GDPR and all the ISOs and everything. But yeah, I mean, HD Insight, if you look at HD Insight's page on the Azure documentation, it already supports a lot of other compliance policies. But the security functionality, when it goes GA, it will have adhere to the same things. Any other questions so far? Okay, so let's move on to the next segment where I want to show you a demo of ADLS and data lake security. and how HD Insight clusters are created using the data lake functionalities. So here I have a new tenant called a secure Hadoop RC tenant. And this is because, as I mentioned before, there is a limitation that the customer should not have multi-user or multi-factor authentication. On this cluster, I have created a new tenant, and I have two different users called Alice Test and Blob Test. This is a data lake store, HDI Security ADLS demo, and there is a users folder. In the users folder, there is an Alice Test folder and a Bob Test folder. The Alice Test folder contains a file called customer.csv, and if I show you the access on that file, it's only that Bob test does not have any access. It just has execute access on that file, and whereas Alice Test, it has full access to that file. Now I have a cluster which is already created, which is the HDI ADLS demo, security demo. This cluster is created. This is a premium Spark cluster, and it uses data lake store as a primary data lake, as a primary store for this cluster. When I log into this cluster, using, say, Bob Test, for example, and when I go to Hive View, and if I try to create a table which is based on the customer.csv, it should fail. So again, the customer.csv is owned by Alice user. Bob does not have any access to it. So let me grab just a create command. So again, to show you, this is basically just creating an external table called customer with some different columns. And the location for this table is HDI security ADLS demo.datalake store/user/Alice test. Now, when I try to execute this, you will notice that this command will fail, and it actually already failed. And when I look at the failure, it says Hive access control exception, permission denied, because user Bob test does not have all privileges on that file or the folder. So using this, like what we show is, if you have folders on ADLS, and if you have set file and folder level permissions on ADLS, and if you create HD Insight clusters, we will respect those files and folder permissions on the cluster at all. If Alice test was going to run the same command would execute just fine, because Alice test has complete access to those files and folders on the data lake store. All right, there is one last thing which I wanted to show you on Zeppelin, which is the node permissions on Zeppelin. So here I am logged in as the data scientist 1 user, and Zeppelin now has multi-user capabilities, and it has node permissions. So for example, over here, there is a data scientist, the owner is data scientist 1. If I say that the writer is also data scientist 1, and the reader is also data scientist 1, then this node will become completely private to only the data scientist 1 user. No other users will be able to look at this notebook at all, or even execute the code running in this notebook. So that's how admins can do the collaborations of on the notebooks as well. Okay, so going back to the customer scenarios. So now the next set of customer scenarios is encryption of data. When we look at the customer scenarios, they all boil down to just one single sentence, that I want my data to be encrypted always at rest and in transit. So what this means is, as I mentioned before, the data for HD Insight is stored on the Azure storage as well as the data lake store. Both these storage accounts, they support transparent server-side encryption at rest. So if you have some data which is on Azure storage, you can encrypt it using Microsoft keys or using your own keys, which are in Azure Key Vault. And the same goes with the data lake store as well. So you can be assured that if any Microsoft employee goes rogue, goes to the data center and steals the hard drive, he still will not be able to do anything with the hard drive because the data will all be encrypted. Now, some customers asked about encryption in transit as well. And we support encryption in transit by just HTTPS. So if any customer is running any commands, we mandate that this command or the connection to the cluster is via HTTPS only. We try to use TLS 1.2 whenever it's possible. And not only getting any request on the HDInsight cluster, but also the requests which go out to Blob Store and the data lake store, they are also going out on a secure channel. So the request which goes to Blob Store, we use the WASB-S schema of the protocol. And for the data lake store, we use ADL protocol as well. So to summarize, we looked at 4 different aspects of security. So we looked at perimeter security, which is using virtual networks and network security groups, firewall rules. We also looked at service tunneling, where how Azure Blob Store or the Blob Store is, you can create tunnels on the Blob Store so that only certain virtual networks and the resources in those virtual networks have full access to the Blob Store. We looked at multi-user authentication. That is available on all the standard clusters, on all cluster types in Ambari, but it's all local users. For multi-user authentication using Azure Active Directory and Kerberos authentication, it's all available on premium clusters. That's available only for Hadoop, LLAP, or interactive query, and Spark cluster types. Then we looked at auditing and authorization using Apache Ranger. So there are 2 types of auditing and authorizations again. The first is authorization for permissions, and that's available from Ambari. There are 6 different roles in Ambari using which the permissions can happen. And there is authorization using Apache Ranger. We saw that Apache Ranger, you can create policies for Hive, which will be respected by the Hadoop cluster. It will be respected by interactive query clusters and also by Spark SQL commands. And finally, we looked at authorization at file and folder level permissions using POSIX ACLs. So the file and folder level permissions for Blob Store, they don't exist, but we simulate that using the Ranger plugin. And for data lake store, we have seamless integration with those file and folder level permissions. And lastly, we looked at data encryption. This is available, like server-side encryption at rest is available for both the data stores. Encryption in transit, we already have using HTTPS. There is one last piece of encryption, which is encrypting the VMs or any temporary or scratch data which is encrypting, which is on the VM disk. So we are working towards that to enable those functionalities as well. It's on the roadmap. So these all functionalities are available in preview right now. We are trying to make sure that the user experience is extremely seamless and it's extremely easy to use. So that's why we are working on making the user experience seamless before we GA these functionalities. But there are some customers who have already started using these functionalities, even though that they are in preview. Some customers are heavily using it, and one of the customers is Honeywell. This is a quote from Honeywell's data engineering director. He actually wanted to be here, part of the presentation, and he wanted to show the architecture which Honeywell has built. But unfortunately, because of some personal reasons, he had to drop out. But I'll just read out his quote. HDInsight as a big data platform has enabled our data engineers and scientists to focus on developing data and analytics products rather than managing infrastructure and troubleshooting day-by-day issues. The heavy lifting of installing and managing clusters and providing robust security using Apache Ranger, data encryption, monitoring, and scaling up and scaling down is all taken care by HDInsight. This platform is used for a variety of cases like real-time streaming, machine learning, visualization, ETL. Overall, a very positive experience with the engineering team, the product, and the support teams. So this, we are very grateful to Honeywell for giving this code. Lastly, what I want, my call to action is get started with Azure HT Insight. We have a lot of documentation available on Azure. We have a lot of trainings available. There are labs available. There are courses available. So you can go and you can get started very easily. You can learn about them very easily. The HT Insight, if you have any feedback, please feel free to give the feedback using the htinsight@microsoft.com. And you can reach out to us anytime, whenever you want. Please evaluate this session if you like it. And that's all I had. If you have any questions, I'll be around over here. Thank you.